Welcome everyone. Um, Welcome to today's webinar on carbon project basics. I'm Imogen Hickey from Holbrook Landcare, and I'll just give a brief introduction before we start. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country and acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay respect to elders past and present. Our speakers today are Kylie Durant from Holbrook Landcare and Emily Wilson, who's the Natural Capital Advisor for Murray Local Land Services. They will be speaking about some of the basic concepts of carbon projects for both environmental planting and soil carbon. And we will have a Q&A at the end to answer your questions. And you can also use the Q&A section in Teams, and we can answer those during the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll make the recording available on the Holbrook Landcare website and YouTube. There'll also be a quick survey question at the end of the webinar, so we'd really appreciate if you could fill those out so that we're providing information that's relevant to you. Also, would like to acknowledge that this webinar is supported by the New South Wales Government through a low carbon landscapes grant, and a disclaimer that the information in this webinar is not intended to be financial advice. Okay, so we can get started. We start with Kylie's presentation.
Thank you, Emmy. So my role here at Holbrook Landcare as the NRM technical lead. Been working with these sort of carbon projects for a while now, and what I'm going to start with is a bit of a zoom out as to the most common question that we are getting is like, why are we doing this? You know, what is this carbon thing, and what is it all about, and how does it affect me? So I thought we'll just zoom out for a bit. So Jen, if you'd like to go to my first slide. First slide. Yep. So that question, you know, why are we talking about carbon on farms at all? And I think that most people know this inherently, but from, you know, all that's been going on in the last few years, but there is, you know, the global shift towards doing something about emissions in order to address climate change is what's really driving all of this. And what happens is at the global level, we sign up to certain treaties, we sign up to do certain things as a country and as a nation. And so that global shift translates down the line into our government policies. Okay, so Australia has a net zero emissions target. New South Wales as a state has a net zero emissions target too. And there are government policies and mechanisms in place to try and address and meet those targets. There's also these global agreements that happen not only to governments, but in the finance sector. So we have two that are very influential in what goes on, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure and a Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. So what they are about is getting global agreements that corporates need to have some transparency about their investment, and that they should be held accountable to where that investment's happening and making sure they're not doing harm with their investment. So that's a sort of global agreement that a lot of companies and governments have signed up to. And so what that's driving is policy within countries, and in Australia it's about having some mandatory ESG or environmental, social and governance reporting for those larger corporations. So when they are reporting that to ASIC, they're required to say something about their impact on climate change and what the risk profile is of their investment. So all this global stuff, like it or not, we've hitched our agricultural wagon to the global economy. And so these things affect us in terms of access to markets. So it could be that You know, the EU can say, we're not buying any meat from countries that are not doing anything about climate change, you know, that sort of thing. So you need to have a system in place in which we can put our hand on our hearts and say, well, here's a product that meets those requirements. So in terms of government and policy, the mechanisms that have been developed are around carbon credits. So the government policy has put in place the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, or ACU scheme, and created the mechanism by which we can now trade carbon credits or accumulate them and sell them. And we're all talking about the same unit of carbon. And they've done the same thing in the nature repair market and created a biodiversity certificate. I'm not going to talk too much about the biodiversity stuff today, but that is a growing area as well. And so we have the instruments in place in which to create carbon markets. In terms of agriculture, if we just flick forward, Jen, you know, the big picture reason is that our greenhouse gas emissions as a country, you know, roughly a quarter, I mean, it does change from year to year, comes from agriculture. So there's a big push to reduce that emissions profile in all those sectors, and all the sectors have a plan. Agriculture is one that, because we are a land sector, there is options for sequestration and things. So you know, that there's quite a focus on agriculture. All of those other sectors have to address things as well. Actually, we might go forward, Jen, not back. Sorry. Yeah. So why is Holbrook Landcare involved in this? So, you know, why is Landcare getting involved in this carbon stuff? So traditionally, you know, the government have created programs and targets around biodiversity or, you know, sustainable agriculture, and they have programs that involve, you know, government grants. So that and the likes of Landcare and the regional NRM organisations, we apply for grants and they're able to get funding, and that filters down to incentives for farm environmental work. So that's how we've always done things. And so Landcare being a conduit for getting that work done by providing funds to farmers. I guess that this shift in policy is now not following that model. And so investment doesn't necessarily come all from government. What they've created the markets in order to make sure that funds are flowing from different sources. So the emitters that need carbon offsets, you know, that they're putting money into the system. These corporates who want information and data and want to invest in change in order to be able to be reporting back on their mandatory requirements for environmental, social and governance, you know, they are putting some money in. And in the biodiversity sector, it's developers who may have, you know, cleared vegetation and need to create an offset. Well, so that money now flows through different mechanisms. It comes through the carbon market and through nature markets down to incentives for environmental work on farms. So the model has changed, and Landcare's role in all of this, you know, we're there to make sure farmers are aware of these opportunities. They're aware of, you know, what the risk profiles of them are. In the end, we still want good environmental work to happen on farms, and so for us, it's about increased, you know, our traditional extension role in making sure farmers are understanding what's going on. With those market systems, it creates a whole sort of paperwork trail, I guess, as well. And so there's a lot of monitoring. There's a lot of need for assessment and things like that happens with carbon and nature markets as well. So in the future, maybe Landcare might get involved in that as well. Okay, next one. So the big question, why might you decide to do a carbon project? I thought I'd bring forward the most common reasons. And look, in these sort of early stages of uptake, the early adopters, it's a lot about doing the right thing. So it's having, you know, some sort of ethical connection to saying, I want to, you know, I want to do the right thing. It's part of my legacy. And I think so it's a good thing to do, and so that drives some people. It being the incentive pathway to achieve things on the farm is the next thing. So I might think, oh, you know, I've got my farm, I want to change it up, I want to change the paddocks, I want to do pasture improvement, I want to, you know, re-veg, I want to, you know, create a different farm. Well, how are you going to do that, and where do the means come from? And in some instances, carbon and nature projects might be able to provide that, the funding for some of that. In some of the bigger farming operations and corporate scale operations, they might want a portfolio of nature and climate positive actions that they can use, and that's good for marketing your business, and it may become that it's important for market access, for accreditation schemes, that sort of thing. So if you've got some of this stuff going on, it can be good through your supply and value chains, and that it's called insetting, I guess, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. It can create diverse income streams. So we often use the example, you know, you've got that hill paddock that has, you know, it's never that productive. I'm chasing weeds on it all the time. You know, it's one of those things. What happens if I put it to trees? What if I did a big carbon project on it? Would the income from the carbon project be comparable to the income that I'm getting from agriculture, or would it be better without all the problems that go along with it? And so, and you know, in harder times, in drought times, is that income that could come into the farm business, which is not reliant on the climate extreme, or is not subject to the risks of the climate extremes. In some instances, it's about offsetting stuff in your own farm. Not, I guess for bigger corporates, they might be doing something somewhere else that they need some offsets, and so that might drive doing things on farm. The next slide, please. So some of the reasons that I do here, but are probably not great reasons, is it's because everyone else is doing it and it's the latest thing, and why shouldn't we should do that? And I heard you can make a lot of money. And that seems to, you know, we read in the Land every week, you know, there's some new case study of a farm that's done X, Y, and Z, and are speaking the fact that it's making them money. But you know, both of those things are not necessarily true. So I think the important message is you don't be driven by the carbon alone. It's not money for nothing. Okay, as we will explain further on, it's when you take on a project, you are agreeing to do something and be rewarded, hopefully, for that. But it's not as straightforward as someone's just going to pay you to do something. And that's the end of the transaction. The best reason for doing something is because carbon, or the carbon project, could mean that it can make something happen that you want to do anyway. And that's change to management or a practice that contributes to your profitable business. And so that's the best. It's really thinking about the business first and how it fits is really important. Next slide. This is really ugly, sorry. I've just realised how ugly it really is, but anyway, hopefully it will still tell the story. I just wanted to talk about regulated versus unregulated markets in carbon, because they both do exist. So the diagram before that talked about carbon markets and nature markets, the regulated pathway in Australia is the ACCU system and the ACCU scheme. And yeah, we've got nature repair, biodiversity certificates, and in New South Wales, we've got the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. These are all highly regulated mechanisms that provide a lot of assurance and reduce the risks around, you know, people selling you something that's not real, because they're quite onerous processes to go through, which means the carbon and the biodiversity outcomes are pretty real as well. And so that's important. They have a very high integrity. Not to say they can't be gamed, I'm sure they can, but it's a regulated market. When someone says, I'm selling you an ACCU, we all know what that ACCU is. It's been produced from a method. It's the same for everybody. There is another, the unregulated market as well, which is becoming more and more a thing, probably driven by this corporate ESG sort of reporting requirements. So large, very large corporations, you know, Kellogg's, Nestle, looking to invest in good environmental things in order to be able to report that back, that they're doing good things with their investment. And sometimes that the mechanisms that happens might not be through the ACCU program or any of these regulated systems. So we've seen a couple of examples recently with so companies or organisations that are sort of aggregators for all these companies who want to put money in. I guess they are looking to move in and offer individual contracts to farmers for whatever. And it may not be that they're ACCUs, it may be just practice changes or something, and they have their own verification systems. So yeah, it's important to know that there are both things going on. There are pros and cons to both, and really, it's the risk of the unregulated market is all, it's about what contracts there are. So it's just in being really doing your due diligence on contracts. Next slide, please. Emily will go into this a bit more, but I just wanted to say, when I said it's not money for nothing and that there is change required, the change is about has to run with a methodology. So there are a set of rules around your project, and carbon markets have a concept called additionality. So there is inherent in the legislation, everything is that they will not pay for something that was going to happen anyway. So that there has to be some sort of change of management. And I think that's really important to realise. You're not going to get paid for something that you have done, or that is just business as usual. And the other main thing is that if you want to do a project, you've got to register before you do anything on the ground, because again, if it's already started, it's not considered additional. So the methods, I'll flash these up, but I think Emily will go into them a bit more. Straight off, the Clean Energy Regulator is the government organisation that contains all the information and stuff that you need about projects, and this is just straight from them. So there are agricultural methods, the soil carbon one is there. Next slide, please. And then there's vegetation methods, so which I think, yeah, we'll talk about a bit more. So there is here, some of these aren't relevant at all, but there's a forestry method, and then there's a revegetation or reforestation method. So through the cer.gov.au is your information point for all the projects. Next slide. You can look at the spread of registered projects. It's public. So if you do a project, the name of it becomes public and roughly where it is by postcode. So I just ran, this is straight off the Clean Energy Regulator map, the 2644 postcode, they're the projects that are registered within that. Next slide. So there's eligibility as well that and this is reiterating messages I've already said. So there has to be some sort of change in practice. We're not getting paid for business as usual. So when you look at the method, the eligibility is in there, and sometimes there are minimum sizes or minimum requirements. There's areas that are excluded from certain things, and you can usually look at that on a map. So before you go any further, it's really sorting out the eligibility. There are sometimes scale restrictions, although they're not necessarily minimum areas to be eligible, but there are, I think, and Emily will talk about this a bit more, that you got to think about the scale. Like, this is a process. To register a project is quite a process. And the benefit of doing it for very small returns, you would have to weigh that up. So scale can be really important. And just to know that your bank and other interest holders on the property, they have to consent to all of this as well. It's an agreement for all business interests, and it has, owning ACCUs has tax and business implications. So if you're thinking about it, you've got to talk to your accountant, you've got to get good advice on all that stuff. You're committing to long-term contracts. It's 25 years is becoming more common, but it's 25 to 100-year contracts. Realizing you don't get paid up front. It's not like, oh, I'll do my project and I get all my money. There is ongoing reporting over that 25 years, and it's not necessarily that same amount of money every year either. It's, it changes the rates over those years. It's about the actual sequestration of carbon. In the trees, you can look at models and know that going forward. Soils, it's not so obvious. So it's a big commitment. And I think that there is the key message from us is it's about due diligence, and it's about looking for, okay, what's being driven by what the change you want to make, not how you're going to fund it. I think is the key thing. If the change that you're going to make is going to make, it's got to be good for the business as well. And, most things that you do to increase soil carbon are things you want to be doing for your production anyway. So it's not like it's an out of the box activity, but just having some awareness over what the I guess looking forward, what's the evidence around that's out there that says if I do A, B, and C, I'm going to get a soil carbon increase. Trees, it's quite obvious, but in terms of soil carbon, that can be quite interesting. And that's another role for Landcare, is to try and get some of that evidence so that you can make good decisions about it. So that's all really from me. I'll hand over to Emily, who's the Natural Capital Advisor for Murray Local Land Services, who has much more detailed knowledge about these things. So thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Kylie. I know you have been working in this space and doing a lot of your own investigation for a long time, so you definitely know your stuff well. But yeah, thank you for asking me to present today. Let me just share my screen and hope that this is all going to work. Beautiful. Can you guys all see that? Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks, Kylie and Imi and Holbrook Landcare for asking me to speak today. My name's Emily Wilson. I'm the Natural Capital Advisor for Murray Local Land Services, and I'm here to talk to you in a bit more detail about carbon projects and some of the considerations on what to look into and what sort of components you need to look at to work out if it's the right sort of thing for your business and your farm. As a little bit of background, I have worked for Local Land Services for a couple of years. Before that, I actually worked for a carbon company. So I was helping farmers scope out whether a carbon project was the right step for them in the soil carbon space, and helping sort of manage soil carbon projects. And I've also had a bit of experience in the vegetation project side. So yeah, pretty intimately definitely know my way around carbon projects. So yeah, today I want to talk about, I guess, a couple of the methods that are relevant for this region, how to work out whether a project actually stacks up on your farm or not, just some of the steps involved in registering a project and getting those credits, looking at, I guess, the technical help and support you need with a carbon project and some of the different partnership models that are out there that provide that support, and then sort of choosing the right partner. So, how do you know that one company is better than the other for your specific set of circumstances? So Kylie talked a little bit about the regulated and unregulated market. So when we talk about a carbon project, that's the regulated market. So going back to basics, it is a project that's registered with the Clean Energy Regulator, the CER, which is the Australian Government, that aims to either reduce emissions or increase carbon sequestration under an approved methodology. So in agriculture, there are some avoided emissions projects. That would be, you might have heard about effluent management in dairy or methane capture in piggeries. But in this case, and in this webinar, we're going to concentrate on sequestration projects because they're the most relevant to sort of majority of our agricultural enterprises. So sequestration means the storage of carbon in the landscape, and we store carbon in either woody biomass, so our trees, or in the soil. Carbon, like other nutrients, is always cycling. So I've got a little carbon cycle basic diagram up. As we know, plants will breathe in carbon dioxide, turn that into plant material and carbohydrates, and will store that in their plant tissue and also pump it out in the soil through their root systems. We have microbial and soil biology, fungi, decomposing that and eating that carbon and sort of breathing it back out. So that sort of loops the cycle. We have livestock that'll be eating our grass and our plants and breathing it back out as well. And we also have a few other loss pathways such as erosion. So when we talk about carbon farming or trying to increase carbon sequestration in the landscape, we're not talking about stopping it cycling. What we're wanting to do is increase the in arrows in our sort of system while keeping the out arrows the same. And so as farmers, we influence the carbon cycle through our land management. We want it to be cycling because the breakdown of plant material and biomass feeds our livestock, feeds our soil biology, and releases nutrients that help grow our plants. And so what we're trying to do is actually slowly increase the total carbon levels in the system over time. And so that could be the trees growing in an area or the amount of carbon that is being sort of deposited in the soil year on year. So levels will always go up and down through the seasons, especially with soil carbon, but we're really trying to increase that amount slowly over time, which is why these projects are 25 years. So a project works by measuring carbon at the starting point of a project, which is also known as the baseline period. So this is your baseline amount of soil carbon for tree plantings. You're planting where trees weren't before, so it's going to be 0, but for soil carbon, you're going to have to go in and measure that starting point. Then we go back in and remeasure it, and then that increase in soil carbon or in vegetation carbon is the sort of credits that we get as part of our carbon project. And 1 credit is equivalent to 1 atmospheric tonne of carbon dioxide. And in carbon projects, our credits are called Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs. So that's a term that I'll keep using during this presentation. So relevant methods for the Holbrook region and for sort of Murray in general. We have environmental plantings and we have our soil carbon projects. So as Kylie touched on, each sort of project type has its own methodology, and the method will contain the sort of information and rules around how that project has to run and what activities have to happen as part of it. And so each, to sort of register a carbon project or to be eligible for a carbon project, you have to have a change in management. So for environmental plantings projects, that's pretty simple. Your activity is planting trees. So you're planting native trees where there weren't trees before. It can be in a block formation, linear plantings like shelter belts. You can plant out your back paddock however you want. With soil carbon, we're looking at either a new activity in our farming system or our agricultural system, or changing our farming system a little bit so that we're doing an activity differently to how we did it before. And in our soil carbon projects, most of these activities really align with best practice and actually can boost your agricultural production. So I guess thinking about how you currently run your farm and sort of if there's any management improvements or changes you want to make and whether these align or are eligible activities as part of a soil carbon project can help you work out whether it's something that might be worth taking on. And so each activity might have a different impact on the amount of carbon you can store, depending on your system and your starting point. But yeah, some of the activities are changing up your grazing management. So that can be changing the timing, intensity, or duration of grazing, so moving to a bit of a rotational system. It can be putting in new pastures or changing up your pasture composition, so using a multi-species pasture or including more legumes in your pasture system. It can be altering your crop rotations or converting to a pasture system or incorporating sort of more pasture phases in your cropping rotation. It can be adapting your sort of tillage system or your stubble retention. And even things that, you know, we really do as part of our farming system, like fertilizing our soil, looking at our pH and applying lime or gypsum, they're also things that can make you eligible for a carbon project. And so even if you've done some of them in the past, it doesn't always have to be brand new. It can be doing it sort of at a greater degree than you were doing before. So you've worked out that you want to plant trees, or that you want to sort of make a few changes to your agricultural system and your management system, but how do you know whether a project's actually right for you? So firstly, you need to get an indication of whether the project is financially viable. So how much carbon can you actually build in the system or in the landscape from the change that you're wanting to make? So for tree planting, it can be a little bit more cut and dry. For soil carbon, it's a bit more nuanced, because carbon accumulation in our soil can depend on our climate, our soil type, what management system we're in already, and what change we're going to make, because different changes will have a different sort of level of influence over the soil carbon and the soil system. So we're looking at how much carbon we might be able to store for over the 25-year period that our projects last for, but then also what's that hectare per year yield. Projects have fixed costs, which I'll talk about a bit later, but there's a bit of compliance and rigor involved, because they're a pretty robust and high integrity system. But so you also need to make sure that you have the scale to make enough carbon credits to be able to cover those project costs and those fixed costs. So I guess project costs can increase with the size of a project, but there are those costs that will just come with every project. So they can be things like project admin, planting costs, audits, cost of measurement and soil sampling, etc. So if you've worked out that a project looks like it might stack up financially on your place, then you have to ask, does it actually fit in with my farm, my landscape, my farm goals, my production system? So with vegetation, I guess that's a bit of an either or with your ag system, but we know that planting trees and incorporating vegetation in our landscape can have productivity benefits, can have resilience benefits, and can have other benefits in our farming system. So such as our shade and shelter for livestock, water storage on farm, etc. When we're talking about our soil carbon projects, a lot of those activities will boost production or support our soil health. But a carbon project, as Kylie said, shouldn't be done for the extra income it might bring in alone. It should really be integrated in with your farming system and your natural assets to sort of maximise that benefit. So it could be providing productivity benefits like increasing your carrying capacity, improving your soil health and fertility, or boosting crop yields. It could also be creating new habitat for threatened species in your local area, while also producing shade and shelter for your livestock. And I guess on the financial side, as Kylie touched on as well, does the carbon income allow you to fast track management improvements you wanted to make anyway, paddock renovations or soil amelioration, such as putting on lime? Does it allow you to invest in your place quicker or expand your farming enterprise? And then I guess the third part of that is assessing where you're at your farming journey, and whether it matches your risk appetite and whether the potential benefits of the project are worth the compliance. So are you at a point in time where you don't want to take on any more risk or debt? Are you at a time where you're sort of wanting to downsize or sell your farm soon? And how could a project impact that process? It's a 25-year commitment, so you also need to, I guess, have a think about succession, have a chat to your kids, work out if they're on board with it. Yeah, so there's a few things to sort of think through, but getting in some of that technical support can also help de-risk the process and the time commitment from you. So just on the financial side, I wanted to flick up some potential revenue from carbon projects in the region. So I've got some, I guess, just to show that the economics of a project are really dependent on that yield. And so I've got a couple of different rates, a low and a high rate for environmental plantings, and for soil. And so for the Holbrook region, in a lot of the flat country, and sort of as you head further west across the region, you might be able to expect around 10 ACCUs or 10 credits per hectare per year. Just a quick disclaimer, this isn't financial advice. This is a really simple back of the envelope workings that's general and sort of takes into account the current prices for credits, but go do your homework, don't rely on this. But yeah, looking at, I guess, environmental plantings, which can be getting up $57 or $58 per credit, that could actually look at that sort of 10 credits per hectare per year rate to be about $600 in revenue per year. And once you get up to 21 ACCUs per year, which there were a few areas as you go further east that do sort of have that higher rate, it could be looking at over $1,000 in revenue per year. And so that's not taking into account costs of the project. When we're looking at soil, I guess there can be a bit more variation in some of the rates you might get on the same piece of land. But if we look at some sort of more conservative amounts compared to a higher amount, if you can get 0.5 tonnes per hectare per year of carbon, which translates to 1.3 credits per year, you're going pretty well. And that's looking at to be about $49 or $50 per hectare per year on top of your current agricultural system. And then if you really can drive your land and your project a bit higher, that might go up to about $100 per hectare per year. And I guess the difference with the soil carbon is that that's on top of your existing agricultural production. So that's sort of an extra income above your agricultural production income. And just to note that there are some price differences for credits from different projects. So that's why environmental plantings at the moment are getting a slightly higher credit price on the market, whereas your soil, there haven't been too many credit sales yet. And so I've just put the average credit price for the moment in there. So when we're thinking about registering a project, there are a few steps involved. As Kylie mentioned, we can't actually start doing our activity until after we've registered the project. So you've identified that the project suits, it will be a good source of income on your farm. So first up, I guess you'll need to design your project and gather up some of those registration documents. So that process includes some pretty detailed project mapping, species selection for tree plantings, and drafting up either your planting plan for vegetation, or if you're doing a soil project, your land management strategy, and making sure that you actually think that the management change you make on your farm system can drive that increase, can actually drive an increase in soil carbon. That can be, I guess, the time that might be a bit more involved for the farmer. So you need to get your head around what a carbon project is, some of the components of it, and there's a lot of planning and sort of important decisions that happen at that time. Once you've got everything ready, you go to the CER, the Clean Energy Regulator, and submit the registration application, and it can take up to 3 months to approve the registration. And then once it's registered, that's when you can start your activity and start measuring your carbon increases. So with soil, you need to do an initial sampling round to measure your starting soil carbon levels. And then you can sort of do your activity or your management change. And if you're doing a vegetation project, because you're planting it on land without trees, your starting point is 0. So you just sort of go in and plant your trees. After an appropriate period of time, you'll remeasure and calculate any increases in carbon, which is then put in a report that says how many credits you think you've gotten, and that goes to the CER who tick it off. And that's when you get your credits for the project, which you can either keep for yourself to inset or just sell later, or you can sell those carbon credits to businesses who might be seeking to offset their emissions. In there as well might be a couple of audits, so they're third-party audits to just make sure that the project's compliant with the method and that everything's sort of above board. So some of those timelines, when we're looking at vegetation projects, you sort of are going to need at least 6 months to a year lead in to, I guess, design the project before you're wanting to actually get it registered. Generally, we do planting in that sort of autumn winter time here. And so you're wanting to have the project registered, you know, over summer or before you get into that planting window. And so there's a little bit of preparation you need to do before you get there. With the soil carbon project, you can sort of start your activity at any time, but there's a quite detailed mapping that needs to be done. And I guess making sure that the project integrates into your farming system and that everyone's on board with it. And so that can, I guess, push out that time window before the project starts. You have a few months for the CR to approve the registration. And then you sort of begin that crediting period or that crediting cycle. So for planting projects, that can be a 1-year cycle. Once the trees sort of start growing, you can get credits every year because it's a modelled approach. So you don't need to, it's quite simple to work out sort of the amount of carbon you have. In the soil carbon projects, the crediting cycle is a little bit longer. So because we need to go in and actually physically sample the soil and get it lab tested and see how much carbon we have in it, that has a bigger cost implication. So we try to stretch that out. We're still building the same amount of carbon, but if we can stretch out our sampling window, then we're minimizing costs for the project. So that's generally every 4 to 5 years, but can be a bit more frequent for more intensive projects. So just to run through some of those, I guess, costs, you've got your feasibility stage or pre-registration stage. So you have project design, mapping, and sort of selecting your tree species and doing your planting plan. You've got your registration process where you need obviously a bit of admin is sort of done there, and you do your baseline soil sampling, and then you have your operating costs. So that might be going out and planting your trees and doing the fencing, sort of starting to do your management activity for soil projects. Then it's those ongoing costs. So re-sampling all the soil and getting it tested, the monitoring and carbon measurement side of things, the audits you have to have as part of the project, and then the admin and project reporting. And so these activities or costs are all things that require time or technical expertise. So as I mentioned, the cost can change depending on the size of the project, but there is a level of fixed costs involved. So you need to make sure that the project has the ability to cover these costs through the sale of credits or however else you're going to commercialise the credits. And this is where carbon companies can come in. They offer a full management option and have the in-house expertise to do them themselves. So they can be a bit of a one-stop shop. They can partner with a farmer to handle project compliance, management, and even cover some of the costs. So there's a couple of models that I've got here. So you can have a bit more of a DIY model where you self-manage the project and you just go out and contract technical services as you need. So that'll generally be paid in dollars. You're not locked into a single company, and you might actually need to use multiple companies for different technical services. But it will require more time from you to manage the project, the admin, and the compliance side of things. At the other end of the spectrum, there's more of a full service partnership model. So that's where a carbon service provider or carbon company will manage the project for you. So you're partnering with a company. The company will generally handle the admin, compliance, timing of activities, the monitoring of the project, and the audits. And generally, there's a bit more of a profit sharing arrangement that will come into play here, where they might do those services for a portion or a percent of the credits that are made from the project. Generally, in this sort of setting, you'll sign a contract with a single company. This contract will outline the terms of the agreement and what's included, so just make sure to review it carefully to avoid any surprises. There's also a few blended options where maybe you can invest a little bit more or have a bit more of management or control. just depending on the different company you might go with. So I guess, how do you decide if you're going to do a project yourself or if you use a service provider? So the first thing is, what project are you doing? What's the size of it? Is it something you can manage yourself? Do you have that capacity within your farm business? Or do you think you need that technical support? So for example, a vegetation project can be a little bit simpler or lower risk because you've planted the trees, it's a single activity, you can see that the trees are still there, so there's a little bit less to it. Whereas with a soil carbon project, generally there's sort of a higher level of technical expertise that's involved or needed for the project. But some of the benefits of using a carbon service provider is that it de-risks the project for the farmer. So they handle a lot of the compliance and admin, so that takes it out of your hands. They're obviously very involved in this in their day-to-day, so they know of any changes or can pick up on anything that just might need to be tweaked. They'll also cover some of the costs or a lot of the project costs, so that's less of a financial outlay for the farmer, which means that you don't have quite as much skin in the game, or you haven't put a lot of money into this, so if it doesn't quite pay off as much as you thought it might, that sort of lowers that risk profile for you. Using a company or partnering with a company means that they've invested in the project, so they're more committed to its success as well. And also you have a higher level of support for the project and your management practice change. Some of the cons to that, I suppose, or the costs that come with it, is that it's a higher cost, but often this is a share of the credits. So it's money or profit that you wouldn't have had unless you had done the project anyway. I guess another consideration is just that you have a legal contract with the company, so you're locked in, and the obligations there will depend on the specific contract. So I just want to run you through a few questions that you might want to ask. These slides are a bit heavy, but they just talk about, some of the main things to be considering if you're looking to choose a company. So first up, I guess it's making sure that they actually work in the method you're interested in. So whether that's vegetation or soils, do they have local projects and local staff? You can ask them whether they've received any credits for their projects and whether they've been through an audit and how that went. If you're doing a vegetation project, making sure they have an ecologist on their team that has local knowledge as well, not just, they're going to find an ecologist from Queensland because they might not be as familiar with the species we have down here. For soil projects, making sure they have an agronomist on their team or agronomy experience in-house so that they can understand the different farming systems and the implications of some of the management actions. Making sure they have projects in your sort of farming system in your landscape. So does the company have more of a focus on grazing projects? Do they work in the cropping space? Do they have projects down in this sort of southeastern Australia area? Also, a really important one with soil is, how did they come up with the carbon yield? So how did they come up with the number of the amount of carbon that they think you'll be able to store per year? So they need to have confidence that this is actually going to happen. So you can ask for peer-reviewed scientific literature, a decent explainer, results on other projects or results on trials. So make sure you do your homework there. In terms of some of the governance considerations, making sure or asking who the owner of the project is. So whether it's you as the farmer, some of the carbon companies like to be the owner of the project, and I guess that can have certain benefits, but it can also mean less control over it for you as the farmer. Asking whether anything goes on title and whether they've dealt with any land sales or land transfers within their projects. A really important one is whether they're a signatory to the Carbon Market Institute Code of Conduct. So that's the sort of independent industry body, the carbon market, and they have a code of conduct that has best practice. So you want someone or a company who's committed to that. A few other things to ask what happens if you want to terminate the agreement or the contract between yourself and the company, who owns the project reports and data, And also, if you need to get back consent for the project, do they help with that? In terms of the services and costs, probably some really important ones as the farmer is what's the percent ACCU share? So what percent of the credits do they want to take, or how are you paying for the services? And what services are actually included in the contract? Are there any hidden costs, or are any services excluded? So that could be things like you have to pay for the baseline soil sampling round, or you have to pay for any audits, or there might be some admin fees in there. You can also see whether they're flexible in their commercial arrangements, so whether you can cover some of the costs if you want to invest more into the project. Asking whether they do regular site visits and whether they actually come down and see your farm in person. Whether you've met them in person and sort of the gut feel you got from that, because it's a 25-year agreement, so you want to make sure you're partnering with a company you trust. Whether they're tailoring the management plan to your actual farming operation and goals, which is more relevant for soil, but for vegetation, it could be, if you want to create a more biodiverse planting, to make sure that they're taking that into consideration. And for planting projects, who covers the upfront costs of ground preparation, planting and fencing, and who's responsible for covering the cost of infill planting if you need to go out and put in some more trees. So just quickly, we're getting to the end now, which is good because we're almost running out of time. Where to start? Make sure the project aligns with your farm goals and your farming system. Talk to Landcare or LLS so we can provide free carbon advice and sort of access to resources like the one that's on the screen there. You can actually go talk to a carbon service provider. Most of them offer free feasibility reports. They're pretty transparent about what their commercial arrangement is or what services are included, and there's no obligation except they might just keep bringing you up. So hopefully not too much though. So definitely shop around and talk to some of them as that sort of next step as well. For a tree planting, you can map your sort of where you might want to plant and your work out your ACCU potential on a free tool called Planner, which I'll flick up on the screen next. If you're really looking into it, just make sure you read over the contract properly and get legal or financial advice before signing a contract. Talk to other farmers with a project or who've looked into it. And you can come to LLS or Landcare to get a natural capital profile to understand your other options. So just quickly, Planner is an online mapping tool developed by Cyro, so it's free. It is really interactive. You can draw in your property and then draw in different areas where you might want to plant trees. So I guess that allows you, and then it comes up with how many credits you'd make from that area. So it's a really great way to get an indication of the potential credit sort of yield of a project. So you can see those sort of yellow and green areas on the right of the screen are higher yielding. So there's some of those sort of 20 credits per hectare per year areas. And those darker blue areas are lower. So they're your sort of 8 to 10 credits per hectare per year. It also has eligibility. So areas that have tree cover aren't eligible. So you can put that purple layer on top and that shows you where you can and can't plant. So I would really recommend jumping on that if you're looking at trees. And that is about it from me. There's a few resources here that I can send around. And if you have any questions or you want to reach out for more specific advice, feel free to give me a buzz or shoot me an email.
Thanks, Emily. That was really great. Do you have any questions? If not, feel free to reach out and email us with any of your questions.
Can I just ask one, Yumi, probably on the behalf, it's a very common question, Emily. What happens if it all goes wrong? Like what happens if you get there and the soil carbon doesn't show any change? What happens if your trees burn down?
Yeah, that is definitely a big sort of something for a farmer or a land manager to consider. You can revoke a project voluntarily. So if you start a project, you can cancel it. But if you've already put some costs into it, then obviously that isn't always the best opportunity or the best option. If it's a sort of natural disaster, generally the CER wouldn't ask you to pay back any credits, or if your soil carbon goes down naturally over time, they've said they won't ask you to pay back credits. So they keep 5% from every project. That's called their risk of reversal buffer. So I think they have a bit of a pool sitting there. So when things go wrong, areas that the projects haven't been over-credited. But I guess that's where going with a carbon company can help de-risk it financially if they're covering more of those project costs. If something goes wrong, you might not be the one who sort of poured all that money in and then ended up not in the best position. But that's where it's also important to just make sure you ask them what might happen if something like that happened. Like, would you be liable, or would they want any payback?
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I've got.
Okay.
I was actually going to ask livestock methods. So there used to be these things called herd management methods where it's about changing things up with livestock management. Is there a new method that's going to come along that might have that in there?
There's not at the moment on the horizon. There was the beef herd method, and it really only worked when you had sort of tens of thousands of cattle. So some of those big pastoral companies up north have projects under that, but they weren't really economically viable for sort of the smaller properties you get down south. But nothing on the horizon for the beef method, unfortunately. Fergus, did you guys have a question over there that you wanted to ask?
No, good food for thought, but yeah, a lot to take in. But thank you very much. That was very detailed, so appreciate that.
I did have one small question. Emily or Kylie, are you aware of more of the soil sequestration projects? Obviously, 25 years is a long time. Are you aware of projects around our area or that are ongoing and seem to be maybe going to be viable or healthy, progressing well?
Yeah, there are definitely a few projects in the area. I think there's one right in the Holbrook region. There's a couple up around Wagga and near Narandra, up near Junee, and some down in Victoria that have been operational for a few years. There's quite a few that have gotten credits now. I think there's now sort of 35 or 40 projects that have been credited across, like in the soil carbon methodology, and one of them has been down in Victoria in a cropping system. I guess the fact that they are 25 years is where you really want to make sure it's integrated with your agricultural system. So how is the project adding value through the activities, making sure it's well designed and that it's supporting productivity and landscape health, so that you're not just doing it for the carbon income. Like, how else is it creating value for your property so that if you do have to sell or do something in the future, it's seen as a value add and not something that's going to sort of lower the value of your property.
Pretty well all those things you listed that potentially could sequester carbon. I mean, they're all things that I think a lot of producers are doing anyway, aren't they? So which, they do add value. I mean, they're beneficial to the production system. So very interesting. Thanks.
No worries.
Great. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, we might leave it there. Thanks for your questions and thanks for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.